Imagine, for a moment, two of the great uncertainties hanging over the American West colliding at the same time. On one hand, there is Yellowstone, the vast volcanic system beneath the famous national park, a vast, sleeping giant that has produced some of the very largest eruptions in the geologic history of the entire continent. On the other, there is the water crisis, the steady shrinking of the rivers and reservoirs that supply tens of millions of people across the West, a slow-building emergency that is already quietly reshaping the entire region. What would happen if these two great forces met, if Yellowstone were to erupt at a time when America's water supply is already stretched thin and shrinking? It is a dramatic question, the kind that captures the imagination, and it is worth exploring carefully, not because it is at all likely, but because thinking it through reveals a great deal about how vulnerable systems interact and about the true resilience of the systems we all depend on. But before we go a single step further, one essential and honest word. Yellowstone is not going to erupt anytime soon. It is not overdue, a persistent myth with no basis in how the volcano behaves, and it shows no sign of an approaching eruption. Scientists monitor it constantly and see only the normal rhythms of a quiet system. This is a thought experiment, an exploration of a low-probability scenario, not a prediction of doom. And it is offered purely in the spirit of understanding how the world works, not of stoking fear about an event that is almost certainly not coming. Quick honest word before we dive in. A lot of people watch these all the way through, love them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a channel like ours going: hitting subscribe. If you are finding this fascinating, take 1 second and subscribe right now. It genuinely matters for us and costs you nothing. And drop your state in the comments so we can see who is watching. All right, let's begin. Two crises, one region. To understand why the meeting of these two forces is worth exploring, we first have to understand that they share the same ground, the same vast region of the American West, and that this overlap is what makes the thought experiment so intriguing. Yellowstone sits in the interior of the West, in the northern Rocky Mountains, in the very region where so many of the great rivers of the West are born, including the rivers that feed the reservoirs on which tens of millions of people depend. The water crisis, meanwhile, is unfolding across this same broad region. As the rivers shrink, the reservoirs fall, and the demand for water outstrips the supply. The two great uncertainties of the West, the volcanic and the hydrological, occupy the same stage, and this is what makes their potential collision a matter worth thinking through. The water supply of the West is already under enormous strain, drawn down by a prolonged drought, a warming climate, and a demand that has long exceeded what the rivers can provide. The great reservoirs have fallen to historic lows, the system is stretched to its limits, and the margin for error has grown thin. Into this already stressed situation, we are imagining the introduction of a second great shock, a volcanic eruption, and the question is how the two would interact, how a sudden volcanic event would affect a water system that is already weakened and vulnerable. It is the combination that makes the scenario compelling, because a shock that a robust and healthy system might absorb could be far more damaging to a system already operating near its limits. The two crises, sharing one region, raise the question of what happens when a sudden blow falls upon a system already struggling, and it is this interaction of vulnerabilities that we are here to explore. It is a question that reaches beyond the specifics of volcanoes and water, touching a deeper truth about the world we live in, which is that the great systems we depend on do not exist in isolation, but are bound together, so that a shock to one can reverberate through the others. Emergency planners and scientists think carefully about exactly these kinds of compounding scenarios, not because they expect them, but because understanding how vulnerabilities interact is essential to building systems that can withstand the unexpected. In imagining the collision of Yellowstone and the water crisis, we are engaging in the same kind of thinking, using a dramatic scenario to illuminate the real principles of risk, resilience, and interdependence that govern the systems on which our lives depend. What a Yellowstone eruption would actually be before we can consider how an eruption would affect the water supply, we have to be clear and honest about what a Yellowstone eruption would actually involve, because the reality is far more nuanced than the popular image of instant, continent-wide catastrophe. First and most important, The great majority of Yellowstone's possible eruptions would be relatively small events, such as lava flows or steam explosions, that would have little effect beyond the park itself and would pose essentially no threat to the water supply of distant regions. The enormous caldera-forming supereruptions that capture the imagination have occurred only a handful of times, separated by intervals of hundreds of thousands of years, and they are not what scientists expect from Yellowstone in any foreseeable time frame. For the sake of the thought experiment, however, we are imagining a large eruption, the kind that would spread ash across a wide area, because it is only such an event that could affect the water supply of the broader region. Even so, it is important to understand that such an eruption would not destroy the West in an instant or vaporize its water. The far-reaching effect of a large Yellowstone eruption would come primarily from volcanic ash, the fine, gritty material that a great eruption would blast high into the atmosphere and spread across the land on the winds. This ash, falling across a wide area, is the mechanism through which a Yellowstone eruption could affect the water supply, and understanding this is the key to understanding the scenario. We are not imagining a wall of lava sweeping across the continent, which is not how such eruptions work, but rather a fall of ash across a broad region. And it is the interaction of that ash with an already stressed water system that forms the heart of our thought experiment. Here is something I would genuinely love to know, and it takes 10 seconds. Before today, did you realize that most of Yellowstone's possible eruptions would be small events, not the giant one everyone imagines? Drop a yes or no in the comments, because your reactions help us understand what surprises people most, and I read every reply. Okay, back to it. How volcanic ash would affect the water supply. Now we come to the heart of the matter, the question of how the ash from a large Yellowstone eruption would affect the water supply of a region that is already stretched thin. Volcanic ash is not like the soft ash of a wood fire, but a fine powder of pulverized rock and volcanic glass, and when it falls into water, it can cause a range of problems. It can contaminate reservoirs and other water sources, clouding the water with fine particles, altering its chemistry, and making it harder to treat and to use. It can clog and damage the systems that treat and deliver water, from the intakes that draw water from the reservoirs to the filters and equipment of the treatment plants, straining infrastructure that is designed for clean water rather than ash-laden water. The fall of ash into a region's water supply would thus impose a sudden and serious burden on the systems that provide that water. In a region whose water supply is already shrinking and stretched to its limits, this additional burden could be especially damaging. Because the system would have little slack to absorb it, the reservoirs, already low, would be fouled by the ash, reducing the usable water still further. The treatment plants, straining to provide clean water from a diminished supply, would face the added challenge of removing the ash. The infrastructure, already stressed, would be burdened further. And the mountain snowpack that feeds the rivers, if coated with ash, could behave differently, its melting altered by the dark ash that absorbs the sun's heat. The effect of the ash would be to compound the existing crisis, to add a sudden shock to a system already weakened, and this is the essence of the scenario. A water system that is robust and full might absorb the fall of ash without a crisis, treating the contaminated water and weathering the disruption. But a system already shrinking and stretched thin would be far more vulnerable, and the ash could push it toward a genuine emergency. The interaction of the volcanic ash with the already stressed water supply is where the two crises would truly meet. It is worth noting that water systems are in fact designed to remove impurities from the water they treat, and that the removal of sediment and particles is a routine part of what treatment plants do every day. A modest amount of ash in a healthy and well-resourced system could likely be managed, filtered out along with the other material that treatment plants routinely remove. But a heavy fall of ash would be a different matter, overwhelming the normal capacity of the system, clogging the filters faster than they could be cleaned, and imposing a burden far beyond the ordinary. And crucially, a system already weakened by the shrinking water supply, already straining to provide clean water from a diminished source, would have far less capacity to take on this added challenge. The difference between a manageable nuisance and a genuine crisis would depend on the amount of ash and on the health of the system receiving it. And it is precisely because the Western water system is already stretched thin that the additional burden of the ash could tip it from a manageable problem into a serious emergency. This is the crux of the interaction, the way that a stressed system transforms a challenge that a healthy system could handle into a potential catastrophe. The danger of a system already at its limits. To understand why the combination would be so much more serious than either crisis alone, we have to understand the concept of a system operating at its limits. Because it is the key to the whole thought experiment. A system that has plenty of spare capacity, plenty of slack, can absorb a shock without failing, because it has room to spare, reserves to draw upon, and the flexibility to adapt. But a system that is already operating near its limits, with little slack and few reserves, is far more fragile because it has no room to absorb an additional blow. And a shock that a healthy system would shrug off can push a stressed system over the edge. This is a principle that applies to all kinds of systems, and it is precisely the situation of the Western water supply, which is already stretched thin by the shrinking rivers and falling reservoirs. When a system is already at its limits, the introduction of a sudden shock, such as the fall of volcanic ash, becomes far more dangerous because the system has no capacity to spare. The reservoirs, already low, cannot afford to lose usable water to contamination. The treatment plants, already straining, cannot easily take on the added burden of removing ash. The whole system, already operating with little margin, would be pushed toward failure by a blow that a healthier system might have absorbed. This is why the scenario of a Yellowstone eruption meeting an already shrinking water supply is so compelling as a thought experiment, because it illustrates the danger of compounding shocks upon a stressed system. The way that vulnerabilities can multiply when they meet. The lesson is not that Yellowstone is about to erupt, for it is not, but that a system operating at its limits is dangerously fragile, and that the resilience of our water systems, their capacity to absorb shocks, matters enormously, especially in an age when they are already under strain. The danger lies not in either crisis alone, but in their potential to compound, and this is the deeper truth the scenario reveals. Quick pause, because this matters and deserves to be seen. If you are finding this fascinating, tap the like button. It really does help the video reach more people. And if you have family or friends who care about science or the future of our water, share this with them because it is genuinely thought-provoking. One like, one share to someone you care about, and let's keep going. Where the ash would fall and why it matters, an important detail in this thought experiment is that the effects of a Yellowstone eruption would not fall evenly across the region, but would depend heavily on which way the wind was blowing when the eruption occurred. And this matters greatly for the water supply. The prevailing winds across the country generally blow from west to east, which means that in a large eruption, the heaviest ash would most likely be carried toward the east and the areas downwind of the park, while places upwind might receive far less. The pattern of ashfall would determine which water systems were most affected. And it would be largely a matter of the winds at the time of the eruption, an element of chance that adds to the uncertainty of the scenario. This geographic dimension is significant because the water systems of the West are spread across a vast area, and the effect of an eruption would depend on which of them lay in the path of the ash. Some of the great reservoirs and rivers might receive heavy ashfall while others were spared, and the impact on the water supply would vary accordingly. The interior regions near the park would face the most direct effects, while more distant areas would experience lighter ashfall or none at all, depending on the winds. Understanding this helps to reveal that the scenario is not a uniform catastrophe, but a patchwork of effects, shaped by geography and by the weather, and that the interaction between the ash and the water supply would play out differently in different places. It is a reminder that even in imagining such a dramatic event, the reality would be complex and variable, shaped by the same natural forces of wind and weather that govern the ordinary world, and that the effect on any particular water system would depend on where it stood in relation to the falling ash. The wider ripples of the combined crisis beyond the direct effect of the ash on the water supply, the combination of a volcanic eruption and an already stressed water system would send ripples through the broader systems that depend on water, in ways that would compound the difficulty still further. Consider agriculture, for example, which depends both on water and on the health of the land, and which would be doubly threatened by a scenario in which ash fell on farmland already struggling with a shrinking water supply. The ash could damage crops and coat the fields, while the diminished and contaminated water would make irrigation harder, so that the food supply that depends on the region's water and land could be significantly disrupted. The combination would strike at agriculture from two directions at once, compounding the harm. Consider, too, the systems of power and infrastructure that are bound up with water. The great dams of the West generate electricity as well as storing water, and a system already stressed by low reservoirs and threatened by ash could face challenges to its power generation as well as its water supply. The transportation networks, the treatment facilities, the countless systems that depend on water and that would be affected by ash would all be strained by the combined crisis, and the effects would ripple outward through the interconnected systems of the region. This is the nature of compounding crises, that they do not simply add together, but interact and multiply, each making the other worse, and their combined effect reaching into many systems at once. The scenario of Yellowstone erupting while the water supply is already shrinking is, in this sense, a study in how vulnerabilities cascade, how a shock to one system can ripple through the many systems that depend on it, and how a region already under strain could find that strain multiplied by a sudden blow. It is a reminder of how interconnected and interdependent the systems of modern life truly are, and of how a crisis in one can become a crisis in many. The economy, too, would feel the combined blow, because water is the foundation of so much economic activity, and a region facing both a shrinking water supply and the disruption of a volcanic eruption would see its industries, its agriculture, and its commerce all strained at once. The cost of coping with the ash, of cleaning it up, of repairing the damaged infrastructure, and of managing the water crisis would be enormous, falling on a region already bearing the burden of the drought. And the human toll, the disruption to daily life, the threat to health from contaminated water and ash-filled air, the displacement and hardship, would be magnified by the fact that the region was already under strain. The compounding of the two crises would thus reach into every dimension of life, from the economy to the environment to the well-being of the people, and it is this comprehensive, multiplying effect that makes the scenario so striking as a study in how vulnerabilities interact. What this thought experiment really teaches, having explored the scenario, we can step back and consider what this thought experiment really teaches, because its value lies not in predicting a catastrophe, but in illuminating the nature of risk and resilience. The first and most important lesson, to be stated clearly once more, is that this is a low probability scenario, that Yellowstone is not going to erupt anytime soon, and that the thought experiment is a way of thinking about how systems interact, not a warning of imminent disaster. To dwell on the fear of a Yellowstone eruption would be to misunderstand the science, which tells us clearly that such an event is not on the horizon. The scenario is valuable as a lens, not as a forecast. Through that lens, the deeper lesson comes into focus, which is the importance of resilience, of building systems that have the capacity to absorb shocks rather than operating always at their limits. The reason the combination of a volcanic eruption and a shrinking water supply would be so dangerous is that the water system is already stretched thin, with little slack to absorb an additional blow. And this points to the value of strengthening the system, of building in reserves and flexibility, of reducing the strain so that the system can weather the unexpected. The water crisis itself, quite apart from any volcano, is a call to build a more resilient water supply, to bring demand into balance with supply, to conserve and to store and to diversify, so that the system is not perpetually on the edge. A more resilient water system would be better able to withstand not only the ordinary swings of drought, but the rare and unexpected shocks that any system may face over time. The thought experiment thus points back to the very real and present task of building resilience into our water supply, of strengthening the systems we depend on so that they can absorb whatever the future may bring, whether the slow pressure of drought or the sudden and unlikely blow of some rarer event. All right, I know, second time I am bringing this up, feel free to sigh at me. But quickly, If you have made it this deep into a video about Yellowstone and America's water, you clearly find this stuff fascinating, and a lot of you who watch have not subscribed yet. That one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel like ours. No guilt, just a grateful ask. That is the last time. Promise. Let's finish. Keeping the two risks in perspective as we bring this exploration to a close, it is worth putting the two risks in their proper perspective, because they are very different in their likelihood and their nature, and understanding this difference is essential to thinking about them wisely. The risk of a large Yellowstone eruption is extraordinarily remote, a possibility that exists over the immense spans of geologic time, but that is vanishingly unlikely in any human time frame, and that is not a present danger to be feared. The volcano is watched with the greatest care, and any genuine change would be detected long in advance. To worry about a Yellowstone eruption is, for all practical purposes, to worry about something that is not going to happen in our lives, and the scenario we have explored is a thought experiment, not a threat. The water crisis, by contrast, is real, present, and unfolding now, a slow-building emergency that is already reshaping the West, and that demands attention and action. Unlike the remote possibility of a volcanic eruption, the shrinking of the water supply is happening before our eyes, and it is a challenge that we can and must address. The great value of the thought experiment, in the end, may be that it draws attention to the reality of the water crisis by imagining how a rare shock would compound it, using the dramatic image of a volcanic eruption to illuminate the very real fragility of a water system stretched to its limits. The lesson is not to fear the volcano, but to strengthen the water supply, to build the resilience that would protect us not only against the imagined shock of an eruption, but against the real and present pressures of drought and warming and growing demand. Yellowstone will almost certainly sleep on, as it has for so long, while the water crisis continues to unfold, and the wisest response is to focus our energy where it truly matters, on the real challenge of securing our water for the future. The scenario of the two crises colliding is a fascinating one to contemplate, but the truth it points to is a practical one: that the resilience of our essential systems is worth building now, so that whatever the future brings, whether the slow squeeze of drought or the rarest of unexpected blows, the systems we depend on will be strong enough to endure. In that sense, the true takeaway of this dramatic scenario is a quietly practical one, that the best preparation for an uncertain future is not fear of any single dramatic event, but the steady work of strengthening the foundations on which our society rests, above all the water that sustains it. If we build a water system resilient enough to weather the real and present challenge of the shrinking rivers, we will also have built one better able to withstand whatever rarer shocks the future might hold. And in strengthening ourselves against the certain, we prepare ourselves for the unlikely as well. That is the quiet wisdom hidden inside a question about erupting volcanoes and vanishing water,